Welcome to Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release, a podcast dedicated to licensed wildlife rehabilitators and the veterinarians who support them. I'm your host, Gail Buell. Techniques we discuss here are meant for licensed wildlife professionals. If you aren't licensed and trained for wildlife rehabilitation, do not attempt to rehabilitate any wild animal. If you do find an injured wild animal, a wildlife professional can recommend next steps. We'll tackle topics about rescue, care, management, reconditioning, and releasing wildlife found in North America. This is a deep dive into each subject. We hope to give rehabilitators information they can use because they're already going to great lengths to rescue and nurse animals back to health. There are three possible outcomes in wildlife rehabilitation: release, euthanasia, and placement. An injured or orphaned wild animal's journey to restored health and independence is delicate and complex. We draw techniques and expertise from many disciplines. Many animals brought into rehabilitation cannot be saved. The last gift we can give them is humane euthanasia. We will talk more about when this is necessary. Sometimes animals are deemed non-releasable and evaluated to be suitable for a life in captivity. When that happens, we shift to a long-term approach to managing their care, training, and housing. These animals serve as ambassador animals, a term for the animals that rehabilitators use to educate the public. Each episode, we'll speak with experts who represent specialty topics across the profession of wildlife rehabilitation and ambassador animal care and management, showcasing best practices. Today, I'm talking to Kate Guenther. She's the creator of the website Wildfoods4Wildlife.com. This is an amazing resource that all of us should take time to explore. We are all striving for best practices, and this website is a great place to up our game. This is a long episode. We had so much to cover. I hope you enjoy it. So, Kate, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited about today's conversation because it's about food. And who is not excited about food? I certainly am, but the food we're going to talk about is not necessarily food I'm going to consume, but maybe. But what we were going to talk about is food for wildlife. So I thought we would start.
No donuts here.
And no donuts there. No donuts here either. And no donuts on the website, I'm sorry to say. But we're going to talk about more important kinds of food. And but before we get to that, I would really like to hear your origin story. How did you get to this point where we have this beautiful website for food for wildlife?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking me here to talk about all this because it's a passion of mine that developed over many years as I trained up to be a naturalist. And I just, wanted to go on record to say that I'm just kind of an amateur naturalist. I'm not a botanist. I'm not a rehabilitator. I'm not a veterinarian. But I am one of these nerdy type folks that just loves to dive deep into certain topics and just immerse myself in learning. And I was working at the Wildlife Center of Virginia as the front desk coordinator for 5 years. And that type of position, of course, is a wonderful training ground for learning tons about wildlife. Don't learn how to be a rehabilitator, but I'm working with rehabilitators, so I see what their needs are. And then I'm also working with the public to do things like, mitigation of problems they're having in their yards or telling people how to rescue animals safely or when not to intervene with animals. And I'm dealing with the public, and I'm kind of got my foot in different worlds. And in my personal life, aside from work, I was, my background was that I had been studying to be a naturalist. I had also studied over the years to be an herbalist. So I did have some, training in plants, but not like college level training. It was more just passionate, side stuff. And as I worked at the Wildlife Center, I became aware of that interface between the public coming in the front door and what happened behind the hospital doors in the rehab section, and realized that there was a little bit of a disconnect between what the public could do and what the rehabbers could do. And the story I like to tell, because I think this is really the pivoting story for how I got into this work, was somebody came in through the door and they brought a load of a wild food in, and they said, "Hey, I'd love to make this donation to the Wildlife Center for the animals. Will you take it?" And I looked at it and I saw that it was it's actually had two beautiful buckets. One was with some chestnuts that they had from the previous fall that they had managed to keep over the winter. And then they had some pawpaw. So even though these were two different seasons, they had managed to have both these foods. And I was like, whoa, this is amazing. A fruit and a nut. And yes, we'll definitely take them. And thank you for your donation. And I took them to the back, and I very proudly walked through the door, and I said to the rehabber, "Look at this amazing donation we just got." And the rehabber's face just lit up. She was so excited to see these wild foods come through the door. And she looked at me and she said, "Oh my gosh, this is terrific." She said, "Well, what are they?"
What are they?
And I just realized at that moment that this rehabilitator was totally stoked about using wild foods, knew the importance of it, but she herself was not well versed in plants enough to necessarily know plant foods when she saw them.
Mm-hmm.
And she's a younger person, so she, some rehabilitators are terrific naturalists who know probably more than I do about plants. But then it's also true that a lot of rehabilitators are spending so much of their time just learning all the huge amounts that they need about the animals and how to care for them, that taking on learning about plants is really just off their bandwidth. They just can't make the time for it. So that story told me, okay, there's just some help could be added in here that would help foragers in the public link with the rehabilitators who could use the foraged product. And I'll tell you a second story, because this is kind of cemented my motivation to want to develop a website to help connect these two worlds.
Yeah, that's one of my questions.
Part of what I do is I work in the sort of primitive skills, survival skills community, people who like to go out into the world. And we were sitting around a campfire one night, and this was largely with a number of younger people who were in I'd say their 20s. These were all people who had done a lot of, primitive camping skills, shelter making, wild edible foraging, and we're used to kind of living off the land type of stuff. And we were talking about foraging, and they were talking about foraging for eating human foods. And I started talking about how one could forage and then donate the wild foods to these rehabilitation centers to be used to take care of injured or orphaned or sick animals. And all around this fire circle, again, I just saw faces light up. And this one girl, she looked at me and she said, "You mean we can forage for a cause?"
Wow.
And I was like, "Yep, you can forage for a cause." And now I just saw this switch go on for them where they could take their passion for something they love to do, and they could give back to the community and give back to the nature that they love by trying to help in their own very unique way. And this is, again, just cemented for me, how can I help bridge these two worlds so that the animals can get more care, the rehabilitators can get the support they need, and we can tap into a new volunteer pool of people who may not otherwise connect up with the rehabilitation community and make more good stuff happen. So that was kind of how and to this day, that is really what drives my motivation. When I try to sell this idea to rehabilitators to use volunteers to forage wild foods for them, because rehabilitators don't, by and large, have the time to go do this themselves.
Right.
I think it's better if a rehabilitator can expand their volunteer network and get, amateur experts to go do that for them.
Mm-hmm.
But what I always tell rehabilitators is this is going to be potentially a different volunteer pool than the people who normally seek you out. Because rehabilitators get people that come to you, people who love animals, who want to work with the animals, who are all about animals. Well, this is a different pool of people. This is the plant people. And they may not even know that you exist as a rehabilitator, and certainly may never have thought about how you could benefit from their work. So I think it takes a little bit more facilitation to make those two worlds come together, but I think the partnership could be very rewarding. What
I find just mind blown here is that you were able to make the connection, or you did make the connection between the foragers and the rehabilitators, and it's a unique idea, right? Like you said, these are plant people. They're not necessarily going to come to your door because they want to work with animals, but they're plants, and you're tapping into their expertise. And like you said, we can forage for a cause. And a lot of people do want to help. The other thing that is just really intriguing to me is we know that rehabilitation we're part of a service to the community, and we want the community to be involved, but it is so difficult in some ways because we need expertise in handling, or we need to be vaccinated for rabies, for example, or, biosecurity is an issue, blah, 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 all those things. But this is another way for a group of folks that say, I'd really like to help. Here's my expertise. And oh my gosh, my expertise now is being used and I'm helping. Oh my gosh, it's just, I got tingles. It's great. This is amazing. And just a unique idea. So how do people, like I'm a wildlife rehabilitator, and if I wanted to, in my state of Minnesota, find a foraging group or a forager or something like that, how would I go about doing that? That's a little bit trickier. I'll give you a couple of hints about ways I would go about it. Mm-hmm. And it's not just foragers. Let me be clear, too, that, foraging is kind of when you go out into the wild, or you go out in your backyard and you collect a wild food that you've identified. Mm-hmm. But the other option, which really expands this volunteer network potentially out much further, is that you can actually get people who will do wild gardening for you. Oh, yes. So now you can tap into the gardeners. Uh-huh. People who are willing to dedicate a portion of their garden to raising a certain plant food that is wild, typically. Mm-hmm. So I would say, to answer your question, you can start with garden clubs, and put out this idea that, are there any gardeners out there that would like to grow specific plants for the purpose of donating to the rehabilitator? Mm-hmm. You can look at many states have what is called the Master Naturalist Program. Mm-hmm. These are usually state-run programs. Virginia has a Virginia Master Naturalist Program. I know Texas has one. Many states have them. So you can Google search for that. Mm-hmm. Master Naturalist programs are tremendous resources because these are trained volunteers who come together for the express purpose of doing volunteer work in the community. Mm-hmm. around environmental issues, everything from water quality to dark skies to rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. So these are often well-developed programs of people who are just sitting there looking for volunteer opportunities. Yeah, and they're trained. They have some experience. We have Master Naturalists here in Minnesota, and they have to also have another idea here, which I'm sure is they often have to have a capstone project, and so working with and numbers of hours of volunteer work per year to maintain that Master Naturalist status. Correct. And so this is just one more idea for them to be able to connect and give back at the same time. Excellent idea. Right. Then a
A third group would be somebody like a scout group. Older scout groups, could do some foraging. And, a lot of these foraged foods we're not necessarily talking about, hiking deep into the backcountry to get these things. These are often things that are found in yards. Dandelion greens, plantain greens, dogwood berries, things that grow readily in backyards. So, getting motivated kids involved is very possible. And, kids have an affinity for loving critters. So, I think that's an easy sell to make. Might need some supervision or some, support, but
right.
That may be true for everybody, adults or kids.
But
so
it's also a good way.
Shouldn't be overlooked.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And then
I was just going to say that with scout groups and 4-H clubs and things like that, having supervision and everything is really important. But the other benefit for the kids, I think, is we're always, and I'm also a naturalist, we're always trying to, how do we get kids outdoors? How do we get them more engaged? All that kind of stuff so that they feel a lot more connected to the planet. And this is a direct connection to the planet. Not only learning about the foods, but how the foods are used. And, oh my gosh, I'm contributing. So what could be better? Right.
You may not have the motivation to figure out what that berry is in the back corner of your yard if you're just trying to figure it out just for, your own edification. But if you have a reason to figure it out, like, hey, if I figure out what that berry is that I don't know, I might find out that it's something I can use in my foraging project. Now you've increased your need. And in the learning tradition that I came from, through the nature connection movement, that's where I got my naturalist training. And in that model of naturalist training, they're always working to create a need, a reason you have to learn something. The reason you learn to make fire by rubbing sticks together is because you're going to be cold if you don't. Not just because it's fun to do, but you have a need for it. So by having kids have an involved project where they have a need to feed a raccoon that they know came in last week, that increases their motivation to need to learn. And it'll take them out. That's the way it's motivated me. A lot of times I've gone out of my way to learn about a plant because I was so stoked about being able to see if I could link it up to an animal that my rehabilitator may have had. And then it just was so much more motivating.
Right.
So yes, I think that double edge of training up the kids and getting them outdoors and increasing a reason for them to engage with that activity I agree with that 100%. The third group I just want to make a shout out to and also make people aware of is this nature connection movement is kind of a growing thing around the country. And this is a group of people that isn't it's not the master naturalists necessarily, or the scouts or the gardeners. It's these primitive skills, bushcraft, survival communities that are doing a tremendous amount with wild edible foraging out there. They're doing a lot with, making acorn flour and harvesting hickories to make hickory nut milk. And they're, using this for cooking with human foods. But these folks have a lot of skills and are another really good potential source of volunteers if you can link up with them. So the way to find those folks, if they're in your community, would be to use those terms that I just said to as a Google search term.
Okay.
Bushcraft, survival communities, nature connection communities, wilderness awareness communities. And you might be able to turn up a little local school or something in your area that would be another source of volunteers.
Oh, you're right. There are a lot of schools now that have gardens or places that they go to that they're in the woods or doing citizen science, things like that. So yeah, that's another really, really good idea.
I also think that there's an overlap a little bit between the permaculture community and the forage community. So if you can find your local permaculturists, that may be a door into finding some of these.
Could you define permaculturist
kind of folks?
Right. Could you define permaculturist for me? So
no.
Yeah. I love it. That's quite all right. Because I'm not exactly sure what encompasses.
Right. So permaculture the word means permanent agriculture, and it's an alternative agricultural movement of folks who are working very sustainably, often organically, to create small farms that use some of the most restorative methods of agricultural production. And a lot of times permaculturists, link up with farmers markets and have that kind of, eat local kind of, eat local, eat organic and low impact kind of agriculture that is, considered the most sustainable. I'm not a permaculturist, and I'm sure there's a better definition than that. But
no, that's a very
by
nice,
and large, highly motivated.
Yeah, very nice.
These are by and large, they're highly motivated. Highly motivated group of people who think outside the box, who aren't afraid to try new things, looking for results, and just often have deep passion and care for the planet and for the earth and the soil and agriculture's impact on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to jump topics just slightly. Why did you decide that a website was what you needed to do?
Oh, well, that's easy. A website was just going to be the cheapest, fastest way that I could get the information out there. I'm just old enough that for me, I love to have a good old-fashioned book in my hand, but that's just not the way of the world anymore. And that would have been more hurdles than I could have gotten over. So I didn't want to go through trying to even think about publishing. I don't know anything about publishing. I'm not an author that way, but anybody can make a website. So that was the way I went.
I was thinking to myself as you were talking, it's like, well, I wouldn't have the foggiest idea how to make a website, but you're right. It's one step at a time. And I didn't know how to do a podcast until I decided I wanted to do a podcast, or the Partners for Wildlife decided we wanted to do a podcast. So then I figured out how to do it. Right. So excellent.
That's right.
Yeah. So I guess, where there's a will, like you said, there's a way. If you are motivated to learn about it for X reason, you're going to learn about it. So just like with the foraging in your backyard or for wildlife rehabilitation, you will learn about it.
I had the need, so I learned how to do it.
Yep. And then how long did it take you before to kind of pull it all together for launch? How long did that take, the prep work?
It took a long time, but I would say it took about 3 years, all said and done. But a lot of that 3 years was writing and research, and getting copyright permissions took forever. I had a lot of copyright permissions I had to get, and that's just a slow process. Okay. Because what this website is it's a database basically of wild foods and which animals eat them. And that data is not data that I went and got. I didn't go out in the field and observe the deer eating the hickory nut and say, oh, okay, deer eat hickory nuts. No, I got that data from other naturalists and other professionals over generations that have put together this database. And then I got permission to use these different sources, and I consolidated and put together different knowledge into one database. But that involved a lot of copyright permissions, and that took a long time. And then it took me about a year to actually build the website.
Okay, and you did that. Did you have help? Did you learn how to do it on your own?
I had help. Yeah, I hired a website developer to help me put the website together.
Okay, because it is,
and he just helped me with the technical aspects of that.
Right. If for those of you listening who have not been to the website, I'll ask what that website is in just a moment, but it is beautifully laid out. And we're going to be talking about that coming up in a little bit. But Kate, do you want to tell everybody what the website is?
Yes, I do. It's Wildfoods4Wildlife.com. That's all spelled out. It's all one word, Wild Foods with an S on it. The number 4, wildlife.com. Wildfoods4Wildlife.com.
Awesome. It is a beautifully laid out website, easy to access, easy to kind of move around it, and lots of fun videos and pictures and everything. So that even makes it even more engaging. So definitely check it out. We're going to be talking a lot about this website coming up for sure. So anything else on your origin story? It's been a very interesting journey. Before you started working for the Wildlife Center of Virginia, were you interested at all in wildlife, or did you know about wildlife rehabilitation before you got that position? How did that kind of connection happen?
Yeah, I had been a volunteer at the Wildlife Center of Virginia probably for 10 years prior to getting a job there. Not a heavy duty volunteer, but I had an association with them. And I just have a passion for animals across the board, like lots of people.
Awesome. I'm always fascinated by how people get connected to wildlife rehabilitation. What made you, if you remember, I don't even remember back that far anymore, and you are a lot younger than I am, but do you remember what was the thing that said, hey, I want to volunteer for Wildlife Center of Virginia?
It was in the early 90s, and I moved to this community to go to graduate school for something else, and learned about the Wildlife Center. And at that time, they had just gotten their brand new building. They were big in the news, and I went down and saw it, and I didn't even know that was a thing. And then it turned out that I had this, really amazing wildlife hospital in my community. Mm-hmm. So really, I just stumbled on it, and it gave me an outlet for getting involved with animals in a different way, and I was just very excited about that.
And it's really influenced a lot. I mean, this website, I'm so happy that you were a volunteer at the Wildlife Center of Virginia and then staff and then made this connection. So, Kate, yay. Thank you for that. It is wonderful.
Thank you. Yay,
is there, yeah, I know. Yay. Is there anything else about kind of the website in general, or because we're going to get into the nitty gritty about the website itself, but anything else you would like to add before we hop into navigating that website?
The only other thing I just want to say is that I've just tried to think about what would be practical and useful for rehabilitators and for foragers and for people who are new to all of this, and what do people need to know to make those connections. I think from working at the front desk of the Wildlife Center, I kind of feel like I have a good read on what the public knows about wildlife services, at least in our community or in our state, and what they don't know. And so, because I know what questions they would ask for 5 years. And so I know what people don't know in a broad sense in our community. And so I tried to keep that in mind as I designed the information to give out.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that. I love getting that information. And I think that everybody really likes the stories, the crooked path on how we got where we are right now.
Right. And it is a crooked path for all of us. I know.
It is. And luckily, if I go down that crooked path fast, I don't get seasick or, car sick or anything. That's great. But bad joke. Bad joke. All right. Okay. So Kate, let's talk about the nitty gritty about this website. So one more time, give me the name of this website.
It is Wildfoods4Wildlife.com.
And so it's Wild Foods with an S, the number 4, Wildfoods4Wildlife.com. So Wild Foods for Wildlife is all one word, correct? Awesome. Look at that. I got it.
Yep, you got it.
I just Google it. I just put it in my browser and it just pops up, which is wonderful. But I want people, we're going to say that website several times throughout this next chunk of this episode because I want you to go to this website and explore this website and start using this website. And this, just to recap, Kate, this website is for rehabilitators, at least partly, but also probably could be for people, volunteers that are helping the wildlife rehabilitators get wild foods for their animals in rehabilitation and trying to have a higher amount of wild foods for rehabilitation patients. Is that correct? Is that a good summary?
That's the primary reason for the website. I think that it also has some usefulness just for naturalists and educators who just want to know what wild animals eat in a quick and easy way.
And I think it is a quick and easy way. But yep.
Yeah, but it was designed specifically for the rehab community. Yes.
And it's most of the website, is it based on, because you are in Virginia, and when this whole idea came about for Wild Foods for Wildlife, you were working at the Wildlife Center of Virginia. So are all the plants and everything in there just Virginia based?
Right. Great question. Because no, there is some limits to where the database covers, but basically it covers the entire eastern half of the United States.
Okay. Excellent.
I focused on the plants that I know and have some knowledge of, and also eastern half of the United States.
Okay. Which is still a lot of ground that you covered. Eastern half of the United States.
Yeah.
And it would still work for many plants on the western side because there's a lot of plants that are shared. But this is a massive project.
The further you go away, the probably the less useful it is, but there may still be utility.
True. Especially on, like, if you're talking about dandelions. I know that's only one species, introduced species, but
exactly
right. But that might be useful for other folks. But this is a huge database of animals and the foods that they eat, the wild foods that they eat. Okay, so as a general overview, how did you intend for the website to be used? So, like, you go to the website, how did you picture it being used? That people would go to X, Y, Z first. What do you want people to do?
Yeah. So what I envisioned was that if you were a rehabilitator, that somebody would come through your front door with a bucket of something, and they would say, "Here, I collected all of this maple seeds for you." And you as a rehabilitator would say, "Oh my gosh, I just got a giant delivery of maple seeds. Who in the world do I have that I can give this to? What animals do I have on site that eat maple seeds right now? How can I figure this out quickly so I can get this into mouths right away?" And I imagine that the primary thing that you would do is you would walk over to the website and you would type in maple seeds, and you would see a full list of all the mammals, birds, and reptiles that might eat maple seeds. And you could quickly look through that list and say, "Yep, I have a porcupine. Yep, I've got that fawn. Yep, I've got this and this and this and this." And then you could put it into your meals and get it out there. So it was really, what I found was almost all the resources that included information about what animals ate, you had to look up every individual animal. Mm-hmm. You'd have to look up, what do porcupines eat? And then you'd get a list. Then you'd have to look up, what do rabbits eat? And then you get a list. But, who had the time to look up every animal you have? You may have 30 species at your facility at any given time. You don't have time to look that up. You need a list printed out of who eats that food. And I couldn't find that. So, that's why the database is set up to be two different search engines. One, you can search by the plant name. So you can search and say, who eats maple seeds? And it'll print out all the animals that eat maple seeds. Mm-hmm. Or instead, let's say you say to yourself, I have a porcupine and I have a volunteer here who's willing to go out and look for some foods for me, but I need to give them a list of what they should look for. So let me print out the list of what porcupines eat. That's sort of like the back end switch. It's like a different search, right? Mm-hmm. So there's two different ways you can search the database, by animal or by plant. And they're just mirror images of the same thing, but it rearranges the data differently. That's all.
That's all. But it's incredibly valuable. I couldn't find that anywhere else that people could put on. Yeah, you just for ease of quickness, because rehabilitators don't have the time in their day to sit around and do research. They need answers, is what they need. Right. No, this is when I have been exploring the website, the thing that it really struck me is how easy it is for an entry point. If I'm coming in with, I got a plant, or I'm coming in going, oh, I need to know what American crows eat. I can do it from both ways, but multiple ways. So not just because right when you go in, there's a place, search box for plants. There's a search box for animals. But on the left-hand navigational panel, there's a whole list of plants. So you can go straight to the plant. On your top menu, you've got other ways that you can kind of interface with the website that really makes it so user-friendly that if you don't have that exact question, I need to know what an American crow eats, you can start exploring, like, how do I identify that, make sure I know that this is a maple seed? How do I store this if I don't have an animal that can eat that maple seed right now? Is there a way to store this so I can keep it longer? There was all the questions that I could come up in my head. I was easily able to navigate the website. So I don't know if you did that, if that was, yeah, it was so easy. So again, I'm encouraging everybody to go to this website. So how did you end up? I mean, because you had to think about all these different categories and questions. Was it just that they came up along the way, or did you talk to rehabilitators, or you've got a background with plants, but how did that kind of all coalesce?
I learned by doing. I was doing this the whole way through, and I know what questions I had to answer for myself. And so a lot of that informed what I wrote about, because every time I would bump into something that I didn't know, I'd realize that I had to go learn it. So, for example, I had the need to make sure I didn't hurt any animals with the information that I put out, or at least to try. So that's how I got into toxicology, and took a bit of a side path into that. Now, I will say that when I was working on this project, people asked me too, well, how are you going to handle toxicology on, it's one thing to just tell people to go feed these plants to animals, but plants can be toxic, and, how are you going to do that? So that was a big sidestep that I had to go learn a lot about toxicology. Now, I'm still a rank amateur, that's my disclaimer. I'm not a toxicologist, but I've spent a lot of time looking at that stuff, and I actually did consult with the toxicologist to make sure that I wasn't saying anything egregiously out of line with what a professional would say. But, again, it was questions that I had, about just making sure that I knew what I was doing that led to some of those categories.
Okay.
There was something else I was going to say. What was that? Hold on. I'm going to get this thought back. No, maybe I won't.
Well, we'll keep chatting, and it may come back up. And feel free to just insert it anywhere.
It may come back up.
It's all so interesting. So toxicology. I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, and the fact that you consulted with some experts in the area. Did you have any other people review or look at different pieces and parts of this?
Again, my information was taken from other credible sources. Right. So I didn't have it reviewed because, for example, in toxicology, a lot of the information comes straight out of the Bible of toxicology, which is called the Toxic Plants of North America by Burroughs and Tyrrell, I think is how you say that name. And so I know it's credible. It's the Bible of toxicology. And then I just had this other professional kind of give me this advice and did some review of that stuff. So I just used really credible sources. And that way I knew that the information, which I did not go out and get, they got it, but right. I knew it was good data.
Right.
So I do have pretty high standards for what.
Good.
Yeah, I have high standards for what gets onto my website. Let me just say a little bit about that, because that brings up a thought that I don't want to lose, which is, how does a plant get listed on my website as being a credible food? How do you know? Mm-hmm. And there's sort of three criteria that I use and that these sources have used to know that an animal eats a food. We don't just assume that rabbits eat dandelions because they're in the backyard and we have dandelions. We have three ways. One way is somebody has to visibly see the animal eating the food and report it as a direct observation. Mm-hmm. The second way is through necropsy, is to do a stomach content analysis. And this is a credible way to know for sure an animal has eaten the food. And believe it or not, there's people that can do that. They can look at the stomach contents of an animal and pick out the seeds and identify those seeds or those bits of leaf, and they can identify those things. It's amazing that they can do it, but that's one way. And the third way is through fecal analysis, because some of these things come all the way through the system and pop out the other end, and they're still identifiable. And that can be another way to identify that a food is in fact being eaten by a specific species. So, So there are some, that you have to pass that litmus test to get into the database. It has to be a credible scientific source of data.
That's amazing to know, and good background for everybody. And we had talked about earlier that it took you a long time to get ready to launch the website because of the copyrights permissions you needed to get from a lot of different sources. So that tells you right there you were definitely doing your due diligence and your homework on credible sources. And because you've done a lot of that homework, then rehabilitators out there don't have to. Like you said, that rehabilitators, especially during the main part of the season, we just don't have time. There's just not enough time. And so if I have to do a lot of research to find out if X seed can be used for, my white-tailed deer fawns, for example, I'm probably likely to reach for what I've reached for before, and unfortunately maybe waste the donation or waste what that is. So this is such a wonderful, wonderful resource for folks to help. So one of the things that when I was reading in the website, like kind of how to get started, one of the things that you talk about is species monographs. Do you want to explain just a little bit about what that is on the website?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I made up a detailed information document about some common species, and it's on the left side of the website. When you first go to the homepage, it'll see a whole list of species of plants. And these are just deep dives into specific individual plants. There's over 1,000 plants in the database, And there's over 100 and I think 30 animals that this database covers. I can't write about 100 or I can't write about 1,000 species of plants. I don't know that much about 1,000 species of plants. There's plants in this database that I don't know what they are. They have the name, they have the Latin name, but it's not necessarily a plant that I personally have had any personal experience with. So I can't necessarily say much about it other than somebody in my credible source list has seen that plant being eaten by some version of wildlife. The detailed monographs on the left are plants that I have personal experience with that I took the time to just write about. And this is the only place really on the website that in any detailed way that I do anything with plant identification. Because this website is really not a plant identification website. It's not a place to really learn how to do identification so much. That's a little bit beyond the scope of what this website's for. But except for in the monographs, and that's the one place where I do a pretty deep dive into how to identify red clover, how to identify black cherry, how to identify common mullein. And I just go in very, very deeply on those specific species. And they're almost always very individual species, not even genera, but species, because that's what I had in hand. So I'm literally just writing about the plant I have in hand.
Yeah, that makes sense. And for a beginner, so if I'm a newbie or someone really kind of wanting to learn a little bit more, I think just even that is very, very helpful. Is I can get a little bit deeper and know about a little bit more about some of these plants on this website. But if I'm somebody new, and you do say this on the website as well for getting started, is that it is not designed to help you identify plants. But are there guides that you would suggest that people go out and get, or online resources for people who are really trying to learn how to identify plants and expand what they know about what animals eat in the wild?
Sure. Yeah, let me come back. I will answer that, but let me say another thing about the monographs. That is that the monograph section on the left is probably geared a little bit more toward the forager than the rehabber. That's an area where, let's say you're foraging for a rehabber and you say to yourself, I think I have this in my backyard. I think I have this autumn olive. And this is a place that then you can go and read deeply enough that you might be able to convince yourself, oh yeah, this is what I have. Now that I can see this full information about this, I know that this is what this is. Okay, now I can with confidence get these autumn olive berries and take them into the rehabber. And so that's partly what the monographs are for. Okay. But if you're a beginner and you just want to learn more about identification, there are so many resources out there for learning plant identification that I think there's probably a lot of ways to do this, but I can tell you how the guides that I go to and the way that I learned or taught myself, and I feel good about that. So maybe this is a point of entry. I'm a big fan of the Peterson guides, and the Wildflower Peterson guide is a source I use every single time I'm looking to identify a new plant for myself. There's two books I use in combination 90% of the time when I'm trying to identify a new wildflower or a new green plant, and that is Newcomb's Wildflower Guide and Peterson's Wildflowers. And I find that if I use these two books, there's a very good chance I'll get an answer or close to an answer for what I'm looking for. They have two different systems of identification. Newcomb's Guide has its own very ingenious system of helping you identify an unknown plant. And Peterson's is kind of a really good fallback or secondary confirmation system. So I recommend those two books because I find them to be highly useful for me still to this day.
Excellent.
Another book I have gotten a lot of utility out of and is a book called Weeds of the Northern U.S. and Canada. And this book was put out by Lone Pine Publishing. It's not a new book. I think it's from 1999. But what I really like about this book is it really focuses on weeds of your backyard. Because, again, I'm always looking for the easy thing, right? What can I get that's nearby that I have lots of and that I'm going to mow down with my mower if I don't use it some other way? And Weeds of the Northern U.S. really identifies just a lot of small, insignificant, meaning not showy necessarily, not something really pretty, but maybe very abundant in your backyard that might end up being something that is useful. So I've found a lot of utility out of that book. Another book that I want to give a shout out to is, as you are learning about plants, you're going to encounter botanical nomenclature and language that will be intimidating. Botanists just have a way of intimidating the heck out of you with their language. And there's no easy way around it because every guide to some extent or another uses botanical language because you kind of have to. It's just like with rehabilitation, learning the parts of the body, it gets kind of technical. I remember when I worked at the Wildlife Center, it took me a long time to get used to the language that the vets would use about the front end or the back end of an animal. Well, they didn't say front end and back end. They had their own language. Well, botanists are the same way. They've got their own fancy language. Of course, there is a reason for that. And to some extent, you just kind of have to get used to it. So there's a great book called Plant Identification and Terminology, an illustrated glossary. And I found that to be very useful because it has pictures. Who doesn't like pictures? And it helps me to make sense of botanical language that I can't avoid. And even on my website, the writing that I've done in my monograph, I've taken a lot of pains to try to write my language to be not botanical, or if I use a botanical word, I'll try to put a little definition right in line with it, because I just know how off-putting that can be to people who just want the answer and they don't want to have to get a PhD just to figure out what kind of a leaf it is. Like I said, there is a reason that some of that language is used, so you'll have to learn a little bit of it.
No, and it's very, very good for everybody, but you're right. You're trying to make it as painless as possible so they don't have to go look up something else. It's right there. The definition is right there. So that's incredibly helpful. As long as we're talking about we're on plants and foraging, and that left nav is mostly for the foragers and things like that. I have two questions. The first one is the guide to weeds. Is that also about non-natives, or is because a lot of people consider there's a lot of native plants that people consider weeds. So they must have a definition there. That's my first question. My second question is on ethics. Now, foraging in your backyard might be one thing, but foraging in a state or national park might be another, or foraging for a plant that might be rare. I would imagine that a lot of the plants that we are trying to get as rehabilitators would not be rare or an endangered plant. I mean, so I'm kind of wondering a little bit about the ethics and how does that get. I know a lot about ethics and wildlife rehabilitation, but not much about plants.
So there are some ethical implications to the whole debate about native versus non-native versus invasive plants. And it's a sensitive topic, very similar to the feral cats and wildlife topic for wildlife rehabilitators can be a sensitive and inflamed topic. This topic can be a kind of sensitive and impassioned topic in the plant world. And it's an important one to think through the potential consequences of. There is a growing awareness of the importance of native plants and reducing non-native plants and invasive species in our whole ecosystem. And that's really an important topic. Our native flora, our native fauna, they've co-evolved to have a sort of like a hand in glove fit, that these wild animals have grown up over the millennia with their native plants, and their physical bodies have developed to utilize those particular plants the best. So when we have new plants coming into our area, wildlife just aren't co-evolved to live with those as successfully. Nonetheless, our wild areas, especially in our suburban areas, in our communities, is filled with a lot of non-native plants. So wildlife are encountering, eating, and utilizing non-native plants every single day, even though it may not be as good for them as the native plants are. They just don't have as much choice to get the native plants as they used to, 10,000 years ago. Because non-native plants are so common now in most of our habitats, they're not preferable, but they still are more closely resemble a natural wild diet than anything that a rehabilitator could use that they got at a grocery store. So I still think that non-native plants have a utility for the rehabilitator to use. I think native plants are better. I think non-native plants still are good for animals to use in rehabilitation. And I even think that the invasive, sort of out of control non-native plants could be used by wildlife rehabilitators in an ethical way, especially if the rehabilitator has an awareness around that and maybe handles how they work with making sure that those plants aren't seed transmitted down the line. So that if you're using, let's say, autumn olive is a non-native and a rather invasive plant that we don't really want more of in the world. We have enough autumn olive. It's not native. We don't want more. But it is a wildlife food of some utility, and it's a super easy and accessible food for a forager to get a large quantity of, and it's an easy plant for a forager to get a very positive identification on. So I would want a forager to be able to collect autumn olive berries and bring them to a rehabilitator, and I'd want the rehabilitator to go ahead and use that food for their animals. But I would also encourage the rehabilitator to, for example, be careful about what comes out the other end of the animal in the feces, rather than just composting that back out into the world where it might sprout and create more autumn olive. Maybe there'd be a way to handle that and mitigate the consequence of further propagating more autumn olive when that's not really what we want. So it's a delicate balance between knowing what you want, using what you have, and mitigating the consequence when it comes to this discussion of non-native plants. I was very uncomfortable with this topic for a long time until I gave a talk to my own home master naturalist group, and this topic came up in a question and answer period. And I could hear in the question that there was some outrage on the part of the person asking the question because they saw that I was listing non-native plants on the website. And I thought, here I go. This is it. This is where they're going to cream me. But this is my home group, so I knew these people. And it led to a very nice discussion where the whole group ended up kind of weighing in on the pros and cons of using non-native plants in rehabilitation. And even the most staunch, fierce advocate in that group for native plants and invasive removals ended up saying, it's completely fine to use non-native plants in wildlife rehabilitation. We're fooling ourselves if we think that this little bit of using non-native plants in wildlife rehabilitation is a drop in the bucket of the problems we're having with non-native plants in the world. It's just not going to be a big contributor to that problem. So I'm not sure if I'm articulating that very well, but
you articulated it beautifully. Yeah, absolutely beautifully. And I think that it really is a way to illustrate some of the connections that you're also trying to make. So this is not just about invasives, but the person who's learning how to identify that particular plant and is realizing through your website or through their guidebooks that, oh my gosh, this is an invasive, now knows how to identify it. It's just like buckthorn here in Minnesota. I think buckthorn is in a lot of places, but it's a horrible invasive. And I got to tell you, every year I have to relearn how to identify it so I can cut it out, cut it down. But this allows another avenue for community members not only to contribute to a cause, but also to learn about plants in their backyard, including the non-natives, in which case they can start replacing that non-native with natives. So, and that would be much even better for the wildlife in their area. So I know it was a wonderful explanation.
Well, good. I'm glad. And I'm glad you brought up buckthorn because I just went to the website and I looked at it. And it turns out that the browse and bark of buckthorn, which is a plant I don't know anything about really, there's four mammals that are listed as eating the browse, and probably it looks like 12 to 15 birds and mammals eat the fruit. Mm-hmm. So, and there's a couple different species listed. So, that's very interesting. Now, my database does not tell you that this is a non-native plant because I didn't know that. I don't know anything about buckthorn, and it's not going to be listed in my monographs because I don't know it. So, that's a limitation of the website is that it's, you might still need to learn more. It's,
I actually think that's the beauty of the website is that it has a lot of just wonderful information and information at your fingertips. So rehabilitators can get to what they need to know now, but at the same time, it allows you not only to explore, but find the tools you need to go farther. And that I think is one of the beauties of the website. So that does, I do want to ask a little bit about foraging ethics. So not necessarily the invasives or things like that, but what does that look like?
Yeah. Amongst foraging folks, there's a real well-known set of ethics. And I'll just kind of go through them because, it's easy. The first thing is kind of the rule of thirds. And this is the idea that if you're going to go out into the wild, you encounter a stand of wildflowers that you'd like to use as a food because the leaves are eaten by a fox or something. You want to use this rule of thirds, which says, you're not going to take more than a third of any given food that you encounter. So that way you leave enough of the plant that the plant can survive so that you can come back and get more of it next year. You don't take the whole thing. You also leave enough of the plant that the plant can reproduce and make more of itself. You also leave enough of the plant that the local animals that live there can use that food source and not have their larder completely plundered by the crazy forager that just came through. But you are allowing yourself to have permission to take some of it. So it's just a nice kind of thirds, kind of keeps you in moderation and keeps you from over-harvesting something. Now, that doesn't apply to endangered or a threatened species of plant. You shouldn't take any plant that's endangered or threatened. So I don't want people to be anxious that if they don't know a plant well enough to know whether it's endangered or threatened. First of all, you shouldn't be taking any plant that you haven't been able to properly identify because you're not going to want to give any plant to an animal that you don't have a solid identification on, just like you shouldn't eat any plant that you don't have 100% of an identification on. That's just obviously wise. But the other thing is that, sad to say, but endangered and threatened plant species, you're not likely to encounter them. There's not very many of them. So I don't want new foragers to be unduly anxious that they're going to take an endangered species. Certainly in their home neighborhoods, in their parks, they're not going to be encountering endangered and threatened species by and large. You'd have to be going out into some pretty remote wilderness areas probably to encounter those species. So I think you can dial down your anxiety on that. As you learn more, you can, be more educated about those species. There's a lot to learn about plants. That's a little further down your learning journey. Another ethic is when you're collecting a plant out there, be gentle with the ecosystem around there. Sometimes I get so excited to go get a plant that I find myself pushing another plant out of the way or stomping another plant out of the way so that I can reach the fruit that I'm trying to get. I have to remind myself, try to be gentle and do as little damage as possible to the plants around, not just the one I'm trying to get, but all the ones around it. Don't rip at plants or trample them. Be a gentle forager. And also be a gentle, good neighbor to the people around the area that you're foraging. If it's private property, you do need to get permission to be on somebody else's land. Yeah, and if you do go on somebody's private property, leave it better than you found it. Leave no trace as best you can and leave it better than you found it. Another ethic we kind of already talked about is when you are aware of foraging non-native or invasive plants, make sure you learn how to contain those seeds so that you're not inadvertently spreading non-native plants around, especially to an area where they may not already exist. So that may mean that if you're collecting something, that you take bags and you put it in the bags so that you're not dribbling seeds all the way back as you hike out. It's, again, having a plan on how you handle your cage cleanouts so that the seeds that come out in the fecal material aren't being put back out into the landscape. Or if you're more comfortable with just not collecting those non-native plants to begin with. Some people will feel so strongly about that they will set their own ethic and say, I'm just not going to deal with non-native plants. I'm only going to collect native plants because that's what I'm comfortable with. And that's perfectly fine. That's a very safe way to do it. Another ethic is not collecting foods that have toxins associated with them. And this is a tricky one because I walk my dog every day and I see things along the road when I'm walking and I think, oh, look, there's some redbud seeds. I'd love to collect those and take them in. I can see them. They're easy to get to. I've had time to see and experience them and learn about them. But the problem is they're right on the road. And we know that 30 to 50 feet on either side of the road, there's an invisible coating of heavy metal toxins from car exhausts that drive up and down those roads. So we really shouldn't ever collect foods that are along roadways. We should at least make ourselves go 50 feet off the roadway to collect. But the roadway is where you walk. So it becomes a bit of a conflict of interest because you find yourself walking on your paths on roads, and then you get tempted to want to get these plants that are easy and right there for the grabbing. But the true ethical way would be to go find that same plant in a safer place. Similar with agricultural fields, you can get some really terrific wild plants along the edges of agricultural fields. But you just have to remember that agriculture uses a lot of chemical application, and by and large, at least conventional agriculture does. So, you may need to be sensitive to the edges of agricultural fields. And the last point I want to make about ethics is just everything that gets collected should be washed. Even plants that you collect away from roads, you need to wash them because you just don't know if they've been urinated on or defecated on by other animals. So it's at least a good idea to rinse foods with some vinegar solution or a commercial cleaner if you can before you give those to the rehabilitator. Remember, rehabilitators are going to be dealing with animals who are already in compromised positions. They're already under the stress of being in captivity. They may have the additional stress of being injured or sick, and they do not need the additional burden of having food given to them that might have any layer of extra toxins or anything on them. So cleaning the food is important.
So along the lines of cleaning, thank you for that discussion on ethics for foragers and things like that. That's very interesting. And I'm not a forager, so I didn't know any of that. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners don't know that. And I think it was incredibly great information. But I was going to ask, so let's say I get a bucket of, I don't know. I'll let you pick the plant, but I get a bucket of that for my animals, but I can't use all of it. And one of the things that you have on the website is at least some basics on how to store some of this bounty that you might be getting. And so I thought maybe if you have an overview or particular points that you want to just get across, make sure you do X, Y, or Z. I would love to hear it.
Oh, boy. Yeah, I have spent a lot of time going into real detail on the website about how to store fruit, how to store leafy greens, how to store seeds, and how to store nuts, and also something about how to cut and keep browse. Browse being limbs of leafy shrubs when you're feeding larger animals or feeding enrichment foods. I don't have a strong overview to give to that, only to say I've done a fairly deep dive on each of those individual topics that you can look up. So that if, let's say that you're a rabbit rehabilitator and the vast majority of what your volunteers bring you are greens. You may not do very much at all with nuts. You may not do very much at all with fruit for rabbits, but you do a ton with greens. So I would say for you, reading up on that, how to store leafy greens would be worth it because you're going to extend the life of this high value food that gets given to you. Wildlife food that's donated to you is so much higher value than the grocery food because you can always go out and get more grocery food. When lettuce wilts, you can just go get more. But when that's not true of this wildlife food, this is hard won food. People have had to go out of their way to get it. Either you've gone out of your way to get it or your volunteer has. So you want to make sure not only that you're utilizing it for the right animals and not wasting it on animals that are either going to ignore it or don't care about it. You're giving it to your targeted, most likely to want it animal. And then you want to try to make sure you're keeping it and extending its life as long as you can so that it doesn't go bad on you in your fridge. Depending on what kind of rehabilitator you are, you may want to just focus in on a couple of these storage items so you'll get more bang for your buck. The one I've done a lot of personal research on was how to store nuts. And that's largely because one of the wildlife foods that rehabilitators get so much use out of and is so easy for foragers to collect is acorns. And I wanted to give really good information about how to store acorns because they're a fairly perishable food source, especially if you compare them to other nuts. If you compare them to walnuts or hickories, those are easier to store nuts. You don't have to worry they're more forgiving, but acorns are not very forgiving. And yet they're such a tremendously good wildlife food. So I did quite a bit of my own research by collecting and doing tests of different storage methods in my freezer, in my refrigerator. And I've written it's a geek's deep dive into nut world. I geek out
into nut world. I love
acorns and nuts. Yeah, it's just so anyway, if that's something that is rehabilitator that you use a lot of with acorns, I encourage you to read about the acorn section of the website. There's under the more help and ideas section of the website, that's where you'll find the about acorns part. And it's a little separate from the storing nuts part of the website, just because I really wanted to highlight acorns in and of itself, separate from other nuts. But the other thing in the more help and ideas that I just want to, is I have a section I've written about just for cottontails and a section of just for fawn. It's my personal opinion that of all the animal species that come into rehabilitation, the ones that may, and I'm going out a little bit here on a limb, I may not be right about this, but I'm going to venture it out anyway, that the species that may benefit most from wild foods, and and I believe all species can benefit from wild foods, but the ones that may really over the top benefit are the super high stress species of prey animals. And the two most common ones that come into rehabilitation, at least where I am, are cottontails and fawns. Just by the numbers, we get more cottontails and fawns than other animals. And they're both really high stress species that sometimes don't do well in rehabilitation because of the additional reaction they have to the stress of captivity and the stress of handling capture myopathy and all that kind of stuff. So I think those two species might benefit the most from additions of wild diets, because wild diets are their natural foods. They're like comfort foods. It's like, going home to your mom's meatloaf. You can imagine if you're a high stress species and now you're in this rehabilitation center and you've got four walls and there's no trees and there's no sunlight and there's all these weird smells and there's all these weird sounds. And now they're giving you all this weird food that you've never seen before because it's all from a grocery store. Is that going to make you want to eat and calm down? Well, it wouldn't to me. I would want my mom's meatloaf again, or whatever, my mom's eggplant lasagna. So I think for cottontails and fawns, this idea of getting wild foods into their diets as a normalizing baseline behavior of grazing and engaging with food is itself an intervention of stress reduction. Remember, animals in the wild spend some incredible number, like 75% of their time foraging for food, looking for it, getting it, breaking it open, caching it, eating it, manipulating it. Working with food is a baseline behavior for wildlife, and baseline behaviors are therefore comfort behaviors. So that's the reason we give enrichment foods, right? Or enrichment things to do is to give them an outlet for that energy while they're in captivity, to use, reduce stress through normalizing behaviors. Well, food is the number one normalizing behavior for most wildlife. And for the high stress species of cottontails and fawns, but it would be true too for the high stress species like chimney swifts. Now, I know chimney swifts don't have a high plant food diet, but again, if you can get naturalized, normalized foods into that high stress species, it can only be beneficial.
The thing that that really resonates with me as you were talking is the enrichment piece of it, but also the comfort part of it. This is what they've been naturally, raised to expect. Even if you've got a young cottontail that has never eaten dandelion green or anything like that, they've got dried grasses in their nest. So they're nibbling on all that stuff right away, which is preparing their GI system for as it matures. Correct. But it's preparing it to eat those normal foods. And so, and we're learning so much Correct. More about the GI system, not just in humans, but in other animals, about how important supporting the microorganisms in the GI is to the overall health and wellness of that particular animal. And of course, how can we, number one, help is with the foods we are offering. So that really resonated with me.
Yes, absolutely.
The other piece.
You're absolutely spot on with that. Mm-hmm. Sing it, sister. Sing it.
The other thing I picked up on, which I wanted to talk very briefly about, is that, and you talked about it with, okay, this is comfort food. This is like the meatloaf going home to your mom, but it's also enrichment. And I think there's several components of that enrichment. One of them is this is the natural food. One of it is this is maybe different than the other foods that we're feeding you. So it's variety, which is important. But also on the website, if you're picking or cutting browse or things like that, let's say it is for cottontail rabbits, or let's say it's for white-tailed deer, it is a form of enrichment as they're learning all the time. So it's not only engaging, but gosh, now I have to forage for it similar like I would forage in the wild. It's not just put on a plate in my enclosure. It is maybe hanging on the side of the enclosure or something, so that so it's a little bit more natural as well. So I don't know if that was your purpose for that part of the website, because I did pick up on the enrichment part, but that's what I took from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can match your level of challenge that you want to give your patients based on what they can tolerate, right? I mean, if they're really seriously compromised for medical or illness issue, then, maybe making them break open their own nuts, you might choose to go ahead and crack those nuts for them. But if you've got a healthy animal who's just, there because they were orphaned or, they're not really compromised, let's make them do what they're going to do when they leave, so that they're encountering the foods and the processes that they're going to take out for the rest of their life once they're released back to the wild. Mm-hmm. So by and large, the less processing you can do, the better, I think, from the animal's perspective, because you're making them do their natural behavior in picking the nuts off the branches or the fruit off the branches and manipulating the nuts and breaking them open or whatever. But it does cause problems too. It causes storage problems because, it's harder to store browse than it is a container of nuts. So there's issues. You just have to kind of weigh that out. And it's very species specific too. An animal like a deer or a fawn in a deer yard, you're going to be feeding a lot of cut browse to that animal. Whereas if you have or even if you have another fawn that's injured and it's inside the building and it's in a large dog crate because of the nature of its injury, you're not going to be shoving browse as much in there. So, or if you do, you're going to have to process it more because it just won't fit. So, you have to make those judgment calls as you go through your day.
True. But they're also, especially in the down season or the slower season, trying to come up with a plan to be able to store them better or to be able to get a steady supply of browse, for example, if you don't have a place to store it. I think that we do, of course, a lot of planning during the down season for rehabilitators. We're always thinking about the next season. What do we need? What do we need to do? Prepare, things like that. And this is one more thing. And, as far as best practices are concerned and animal welfare, everything that we've talked about today is it lends itself to that, is that we want to increase the animal welfare for these animals while they're in our care. We want to increase the chance that they're going to be successful in the wild. We also want to reduce stress while they're in captivity. We want to teach these animals, especially if we're talking about orphans, what types of foods they may encounter when they go out into the wild. All of this is important factors, in fact, essential factors for wildlife rehabilitation, especially of orphans, but of all wildlife. And yes, we often have to make compromises, but they have to be very specific compromises. They can't just be, that's too much work for me. It's no, you plan on the off season. So you've got a plan. So if this is what this particular animal species needs, then you need to figure it out. And that's part of our job as rehabilitators. Our job is hard. And most of us know that when we got involved in it. And this is just another piece. But the fact that this website is such a wonderful resource to really help rehabilitators save time and figure out this process better it's an invaluable resource. And Kate, what is the website again?
Thank you for that very nice overview of all that part. The website is Wildfoods4Wildlife.com. I can tell you a story. It's not really a surprise,
okay,
but it was a gratifying thing that I have a local cottontail rehabilitator who has worked with me since I launched this website, and she's a home rehabilitator and she only does cottontails. And I offered to work with her exclusively to forage for a year and provide her foods that I could forage for her on a weekly basis. So because I wanted to try out this idea of, being a dedicated volunteer and seeing, just how much could I produce and how much food could I get for her and what difference would it make and blah, blah, blah. And so we did that, and she made the decision, and I didn't suggest this. She came up with that on her own. She decided she wanted to do a 100% wild diet for her rabbits. And I thought, holy smokes, that's pretty ambitious. I know how much time it takes to do some of this foraging, and I also know how much food you can go through. She sometimes had 20 or 30 rabbits at a time. And I thought, I wonder if that's possible. It certainly is not what most rehabilitators are going to do or should even try to do. But it was an interesting experiment just to see if it could be done. And that was 3 years ago, and 3 years in, she's still doing it. Now, she was foraging as well herself, and I was supplementing, but I wasn't even providing the majority of what she got. I was providing I think I was somewhere in a quarter to a third of what she would go through was what I gave her. And then she was getting the rest herself. So I thought that was just interesting, an interesting experiment. And she's had good luck with it.
Well, and it's a beautiful illustration, right? I mean, certainly it's anecdotal. It's an N of one, but the fact that she only did cottontails, so it was a really good place to start. And the fact that she said, no, let's make this commitment and see if we can do it. And saying that, yeah, you can do it. And even with 30 rabbits in at a time, luckily, depending on how she feeds, and, she may be only feeding those young rabbits twice a day, which does give a little bit of space during the rest of the time. But not to say that cottontail rabbits are an easy animal to rehabilitate. They're probably one of the hardest animals to rehabilitate in our world. But that is a wonderful story, and kind of, I'm sure that it helped you too, kind of clarify some of those pieces and parts as you were putting the website together and launching it. Can you do this? And yeah, you can. So That's a wonderful story. Okay. So why don't we, if you're up for it, let's go through an example of how someone might interface with this website. And so I'll let you pick the animal, and then we can go.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to pick a plant instead of an animal this time. So I'm going to have you, pretend that you're the rehabber, because you are the rehabber. Let's have all the listeners pretend that they're the rehabber. And now you've got a volunteer who has brought in something that they call dock. They got it out of their yard. They looked it up and they said, I don't know exactly what species of dock this is, but I know it's a dock. And what they've given you is this green plant with a long stem, and it's got this massive seed head on it. And they just they have a whole bucket of it. And it's, a fairly decent amount of food. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, I don't know who eats this.
Yeah.
So you walk over to the website and you put in the word dock. And what gets pulled up is, oh my gosh, there it is, dock. Yes, that really is a plant. Oh, it's a plant in the Rumex. Rumex, Rumex species. Okay. And the first thing you see is it says, caution, greens of some Rumex species eaten in large quantities have caused sheep poisonings from insoluble oxalate crystals and or accumulated nitrates. Leaves can also cause contact dermatitis in humans. And that's in red, right under the word dock. So right before you've done anything, hey, some people who handle this plant get a skin reaction. So maybe I should just be aware of that, because if I'm going to handle the plant, maybe I'll get a skin reaction. Mm-hmm. And then you also know right off the bat that some animals, at least sheep, there is some scientific data that shows that eating a lot of these greens has caused some poisonings in sheep. And they know what it is these insoluble oxalate crystals. Okay. Or nitrates. Okay. So now, before you've even gotten started, you know that there are some things that might be problematic for some animals or people. Right underneath that, so you want to have that in your mind, right? You want to be aware if there could be a problem. Because you're the one that ultimately has to make the decision. Do I give this food to one of my patients, or does it seem too risky to me? Well, you're the rehabilitator that gets to make that decision. And because rehabilitators, like all people, have different risk tolerances, you will make your own decision based on your own personal risk reward ratio of whether you think that it's more valuable to offer or if you want to manage the risk side of it. So you got to know the risks before you can factor that in. And then right under that risk statement, now that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the risk that might be with this plant, but at least it gives you a heads up that there is a risk so that you can then go do more research if you feel like that's needed. So it's not the end of the discussion, but at least you're not going to get blindsided by the fact that there was a risk associated with this food that you had no idea about because this food's unfamiliar to you. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that right underneath that, it now lists greens and seeds, and it gives you the full list of animals that are known to eat those greens. So if you wanted to pick off those leaves, you could give it to the cottontails or the elk or the mice or the voles. And it turns out that some birds even eat the greens. The wild turkeys, pheasants, grouse. Looks like some of the upland game birds eat some of the leaves. So now you know who quickly you could give the leaves to. Then you scroll down and you say, well, here's the dock seeds. Oh my goodness, look at that list. That's a much longer list because so many of the birds eat the seeds, the towhees, the bobolinks, the buntings, the grosbeaks. About 12 different kinds of sparrows are listed here. And so now you could, if you wanted to, take your donation. You could break the seed heads off and give them to your house finch that you have. And you could take the greens off and you could give them to your wild turkeys that you have, and you would know something about that. But if you were cautious or concerned, you might go up and say, well, let's see. In this website, it talks about insoluble oxalate crystals. So if you went up to the part of the website that talked about foraging safety, you would see that there's a whole section written about nitrate accumulation and oxalates. So you could do a little bit of preliminary education of yourself about what insoluble oxalate crystals, calcium oxalate crystals are and when they're a problem. Or you could go to the section about nitrates and start to educate yourself. Again, it's not the end of the discussion. You may need to go to another resource, another website, another book to satisfy what you need to know to make a final decision, but at least it gives you kind of a heads up. So now you know that there is a risk, you know which animals are in your care that might be able to benefit from this, and you know that if you start getting itchy after you've worked on it, you'll know what's making you itch.
That was awesome. That was awesome. And it and over the radio too, or over the airwaves, it totally could understand exactly where you were in the website and what you're doing and what information you can get. So thank you for that example. And it included some of the toxicity stuff that we talked briefly about earlier as well, and how you try to address it so that people can make an informed decision and know kind of, okay, this is my entry. If I need to know more information, now I have an idea of where I need to look or how to look for more information. So Kate, thank you so much. I cannot thank you enough for coming on the podcast and talking to me about your website. This is such an important resource for wildlife rehabilitators, especially in the eastern half of the United States. But I would dare say that, boy, it would be great to have this as a resource. Maybe somebody on the western half should come up with their own website for this. But Kate, thank you so much again. Really, really appreciate you coming on the podcast. And again, the website is Wildfoods4Wildlife.com. And 4 is the number 4, not FOR, but the number 4. And we will have that on our resource area of our website. So again, Kate, thank you so much. so appreciate this conversation. It was so fun.
Completely my pleasure. And yes, it was fun. And you just asked the best questions.
I hope you enjoyed learning about Wildfoods4Wildlife.com. This is Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release's last episode of Season 1. I hope you've been able to get some really good takeaways you're trying in your rehabilitation work. I am now working on next season's episodes. I hope you'll join me again this fall. But please let me know what you think about wildlife rehabilitation from Rescue to Release. What do you like? Not like? What subjects would you like to hear about? Please contact me at gailbuell@umn.edu. Thank you so very much for spending some of your precious time with me. This has been an amazing journey so far. Can't wait to continue. This was another episode of Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release. We're glad you joined us today. Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release is a production of Partners for Wildlife, working hand in hand with wildlife rehabilitators and veterinarians to improve the welfare of orphaned, ill, and injured wildlife. Our executive producer is me, Gail Buell. I'm the Partnership Coordinator for Partners for Wildlife at the University of Minnesota, College of Veterinary Medicine's Raptor Center. To learn more about the Raptor Center and Partners for Wildlife, visit Raptor at umn.edu. Our producer is Kurt Clockey. Are you interested in becoming a licensed wildlife rehabilitator? Visit the National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association website at nwrawildlife.org for resources to get started. And remember, if you do find an injured or orphaned animal, please contact a licensed wildlife rehabilitator in your area. And that's our show. Hope you'll join us next time.